Hey there, Gym Bio. It's time for us to start our last segment of the semester, which is on ecology, which is my forte in the department. In terms of my own personal research that I've done and do right now, I would consider myself an evolutionary biologist first, an entomologist second, and an ecologist third. So I do research in ecology, but there's always a focus in my research on evolution and conservation, and it almost always is with insects too, except now I have lots of students doing non-insect projects in my lab. So let's talk a little bit about ecology. Okay, first let's start by defining what ecology is. Ecology is the study of how organisms relate to each other and to the environment. That's very broad. Ecology is very, very broad, and if you take my ecology class, you will find that there are a lot of things that fall under ecology. It's a very, very broad field. This includes the ways that different organisms will work together to live in a common place, and also how they rely on each other to meet the needs of all of the organisms in an ecosystem. It also considers how changes in the environment will affect the growth and life of the organisms in that environment. And for the purposes of this class, there are multiple hierarchical levels in ecology. It starts at the individual, which is most of the ecology research that I have done so far is at the individual level, actually working with individual queen bumblebees and doing experiments on them in the lab. But you'll have to take my ecology class to learn about that, because for here we're going to start at the population level. We're going to talk about how individuals and populations will interact with the non-living environment around them, and then how this will affect the interaction of the individuals within one single group or one population of individuals. So at the population level, we are talking about a single species. We're also going to cover community ecology. You can think about this as how the different populations of species will interact with each other in the formation of communities within a given area. And then we'll also cover ecosystems ecology. So for this, we're going to consider how the interactions within all communities of the ecosystem will interact to support life on this planet. And this will consider the flow of energy and nutrients within the ecosystem, and how imbalances in this flow and energy and nutrition may occur. So those are the three areas we're going to cover. So let's start by reminding you what a population is. So as we did when we were talking about population genetics, we want to start with a common definition of what we mean by a population. For the study of ecology, the definition of a population may be very broad or narrow depending on the environment that's being considered, and not as we saw in the population genetics, that where the definition is based on the ability to pass genes between individuals in a single population. The most simple definition of a population is a group of individuals which live together in the same place at the same time. For example, if you're considering the ecology of the human population, we may define this population based on location, so maybe an individual country, or a smaller population, so maybe just all of the individuals that live in Westmoreland County or Allegheny County. Both could be considered individual populations in an ecological sense, but there will be very large differences in the size of the population. The area covered by a population may be even smaller, such as the population of bacteria that lives in the gut of a single individual. This is a very narrow definition of a population, but because this is a unique environment, there may be a unique population present. Often the location is going to determine the population, so such as the population of deer that are in a forest, which may be able to breed with deer in an adjoining forest, but they may be considered a separate population. And really, your definition of what a population is in ecology is determined a lot about what your hypothesis is and what the question is that you want to test. That is also going to be really important in determining what you define as a population. So therefore, the boundaries between populations may be a little fuzzy, or they may be very clearly defined. In the book, they use the example of trout in a stream and deer in a forest in a cornfield. Because trout are not able to move between streams, this means the local populations are clearly defined. There is no movement between the streams. So unless those streams are connected, trout can't hop onto the land and move to another one. So that's a very clear definition. But with deer, it's a little less defined because they're able to move between populations, and they may generally prefer one area over the other. One last consideration when we think about what is a population is the species, and although in many cases this specifies a level will determine a unique population, there are instances where different species will use common resources and may therefore be considered part of the same population. But for the most part, we're talking about a single species when we're talking about population ecology. There are three considerations to define populations. One is population range, which would be the geographic area occupied by a single population. This range may be very large or very small. The population range of the individuals will be determined by the environment that is most suited for them to live. So like polar bears, for example, are suited to live in and survive in cold weather, the Arctic. You're not going to find polar bears naturally living in tropical regions of the world. So this limits their population range. Also, you can note for most species that the range is not fixed. There are changes in the environment, and there will be changes in the range of different populations. Migratory species are a really great example of ranges of a population not being fixed. And again, those changes can happen to a range over time, not just in migratory ones that change every year, but populations might expand or contract due to things like climate change or other factors, habitat fragmentation. One other thing to consider when talking about populations is how they're actually distributed in geographic space, and that how they're distributed can actually tell you a lot of information about their biology. So this is often going to be determined by the interactions between the individuals within the population. We're going to cover three types of spacing. These are really there are really only these three types of spacing you can have in a population. You can have random, as shown with this dandelion population here. These are species that do not strongly interact with each other and are not affected by different areas of the population range, and so therefore there's no forced pattern spacing of the individuals. Most of the random patterns that you see in dandelion populations have more to do with patterns in the wind and where the wind's blowing rather than anything individual aspect of the species. So this is a random distribution. You can also have a uniform distribution as shown for these hawks right here. And in this case, the interaction between the individuals is probably the result of competition for a common resource. So water, food, even light availability. For animals, particularly for species of hawks, they may be defending a territory that allows for better growth. So what you're seeing is that you're seeing them randomly distributed because each individual hawk has like a perimeter that they're protecting as their territory, and so that evenly spaces them out. And so they protect their territory to allow for their own individual success and acquisition of resources. For plant species where you see this uniform distribution, that might be the result of something like allelopathy. So like with the black walnut trees that we talked about that produce jugone in their roots, and they will inhibit the growth of other trees around them. Then you see something like that and the uniform growth because of allelopathy in the roots. You can also have a clumped distribution like you see with these elephants here. And this is going to result in an unequal distribution of resources in the population or from social interactions. So elephants form herds, and so that's why you see a clumped distribution for elephants, is because they form herds together and they have this social behavior. You're also going to see, if you think about where an actual individual is living of a bee population, those are clumped because they're all going to be grouped in colonies together. So social behavior is a really results in a lot of clump distribution of individuals within a population. And these social interactions help protect the young. They help them all gather resources collectively together, and it allows them to travel together as well for protection. So one question you might encounter on the exam, the last exam on ecology, is maybe you'll be presented with some pictures of these different types of distributions, and you'll have to hypothesize what could be causing this kind of distribution. So with random and the dandelions, this is just random. It's the wind blowing wherever it takes the seeds. With these hawks, they're guarding their territory, and so this is protection of resources and competition that's causing this. And then with this is social behavior that's causing this clumping. But clumping can also be because of an unequal distribution of resources. So they might clump around resources like a watering hole or something. Let's also talk about demographics. These are changes in populations over time. The study of demography is the quantitative study of a population. So what is the distribution of the different age groups in the population, just as an example of a demographic study. Dynamics would be part of the demographics, which will consider how the population changes over time. So demographics is quantitative study of the population, and dynamics would be a study of the part of the demography which will consider how the population changes over time. So how are changes to the environment affecting the population makeup over time? So dynamics is over time, demographics is quantitative study of individuals in the population. So for a simple example, we can look at the changes in the birth and death rates of a population. So if I were to ask you, how do you think a population with a large number of births and only a small number of deaths will change over time? As time moves on, the number of individuals in the population will begin to increase. If you have more individuals being born than you have more individuals dying, then you will see an increase in the population because you have more individuals being added every year and less being taken away. The changes in factors will change the birth or death rates of the population, will have major effects on the size of the population over time. And so a lot of ecological models will have important components of those are studying birth and death rates of individuals in a population. This may have in the study of demography, how the changes will occur over time will often hinge on the generation time, and that is the average time an organism goes from birth until it is able to produce its own offspring. I'm going to repeat that again because generation time is also a really important factor in modeling populations. Generation time is the average time an organism goes from birth until it is able to produce its own offspring. So Daphnia, for example, this is generation time is measured in days. Generation time in a human is much longer. And so our growth rate capabilities are going to be much slower than something that has a generation time within a few days. So Daphnia are going to be able to grow and crash their populations very quickly because they have really short generation times. You can also link generation time, because I am first and foremost an evolutionary biologist. I'm always thinking about the intersection of ecology and evolution. Generation time can also tell you a lot about the rate of evolutionary change that a species might be capable of. If a Daphnia, the shorter the generation time, the higher their potential for evolutionary change as well. Okay, so all these factors, they may have definitive effects on the size of a population. So, for example, if there's a factor which decreases the age at which individuals in the population will begin to give birth, so like some sort of disease that makes them give birth at a younger age, this will change the rate of the population growth because there will be a large number of individuals in the population which are able to produce offspring. So let's talk a little bit about population growth and population growth curves. There are two types that are based on the limitations of the ability of the population to continue to reproduce. One is exponential, that's this curve here, and that there's no limit on growth in an exponential population. The other kind is logistic, and this is where there will be a maximum population that the area or the range can support. This maximum population is called the carrying capacity. So in a logistic growth curve, you see it increase in population size, but there's going to be a limit at which the number of individuals that a area can hold, and that's called the carrying capacity. So logistic growth curves always level off. Exponential growth curves, there is no limit on growth. They can increase theoretically to an indefinite point, and so they'll always go up. We've been seeing a lot of logistic curves lately, but they've been in infection cases. Although I guess, yeah, we've been seeing lots of logistic growth curves recently, and they all have to do with the growth curves of a certain virus that's making all of us stay home. Haven't seemed to find the carrying capacity of coronavirus yet, and I hope we really never do. Anyway, we're going to look at the different population curves in terms of how the population size will change over time and how we can determine the changes. For all populations, there will be an increase in the number of individuals in the population as long as the number of births each generation is greater than the number of deaths. This is, y'all know I struggle a lot with math, but the thing I really like about ecological equations is they make a lot of intuitive sense to me. And this is a really easy part of the equation to remember, is that for a population to continually increase in size, you have to have more birth than death rates in the population. That's a really easy thing to remember, that the only way this curve is going to go up if more individuals are being born than are dying. If we plot the changes in the size of the population, you can quickly see how the population will increase over time given, certain birth or death rates. If the birth rate happens to be a lot larger than the death rate, then you might see something like this exponential. If it's more gradual and it's just maybe a little bit over the death rate, it would be a more flat growth curve. For some populations, if nutrients are abundant and there's no limitation of space, this might be for something like a virus, who shall not be named, or bacteria populations, the population can continue to grow indefinitely, and that's the exponential growth curve. So let's just go into each of these different growth models a little bit. A little bit of repetition here just to help you understand the difference between exponential and logistic growth. In the exponential growth, it's going to assume there's a constant birth and death rate. So that's another important part of this, is that not only is there no limit on growth, but that birth and death rate are constant, and that's what creates this really dramatic increase. For the graph shown here, we're considering the population curve for bacteria, which will divide once every 30 minutes, and none of the bacteria are dying. And that is a constant birth and death rate. And you can see how quickly the number increases with that lack of death to even out the birth rates. However, death is real and nothing escapes it. It's like the one certainty in all of life is that everything also dies. So a more accurate assessment of the population, or if you're trying to model how quickly, per se, a virus will spread amongst the human population. Gosh, ecology is just so relevant, isn't it? Is that you would include in your model some measure of death rates as well. So, for a virus, for example, not everyone who gets in contact with that virus is also going to be completely infected with it, or is going to have the same increase in viral loads as another person that's infected with it. So you can add that death rate into it. And a lot of people can get rid of bacterial or viral infections as well. So in this case here, for this bacterial population, we're looking at the case where 25% of the bacteria are dying each generation. You can see that if there's no limit on the amount of growth that can occur, you still have a really sharp exponential curve, but there's a shift. It takes longer for the population to reach the same value with death present. You might also see a curve like this if, per se, we're studying a virus and we limit their growth and everyone stays home so that we make the curve take longer to go up rather than immediately. Wow, look at how relevant ecology is to today. Sorry. Okay, now let's talk about logistic growth, which is what we all hope is going to happen with coronavirus. So for logistic growth, over time, for any population in a given space, there's going to be limitations that develop. The simplest limitation we can think of is a limitation in space. You can only put so many bacteria into one beaker, or so many viral particles into a single person, or, oh my God, this is a note from Brother Albert, or so many, or so many snakes in one plane. I love that he made a joke about snakes on the plane. Anyway, eventually food, water, or sunlight, if you're a plant, will begin to be limiting. And when this occurs, there are a couple of things that might happen. The death rate will definitely increase. If the death rate increases, this means the number of individuals in the next generation will be reduced. If you consider food a limiting agent, this means less individuals will have the proper energy reserves to support reproduction, and then the birth rate will begin to decrease. The point where the death rate and the birth rate are about equal means the population will stop increasing and the population will reach a plateau level where the population will stop increasing. This is what we are trying to make happen right now. We are trying to flatten the curve for coronavirus. We are limiting its carrying capacity by not going around and touching each other and creating new environments for the virus to grow and live in. And so this is what we are all doing right now in our houses and going stir crazy. So when you get this flattening out of the curve, this is when you have your birth and death rates are equal and the population stops growing in size. And when you hit this leveling out, this is called the carrying capacity. And this is the max population that an area can sustain over time. So this is that it can actually support, not beyond its limit, beyond what it has available in terms of space, light, water, or nutrients. Okay, yeah. Yeah, and once the carrying capacity is reached, the rate of birth and death will be approximately equal. So let's look at the logistic curve and consider what's happening at each phase. When the population is small, there's not a lot of individuals, there's no limitation on the resources, and so the number that are dying is going to be low, and the number of reproducing will be high. So this is when coronavirus got to the United States and there were all these uninfected hosts that it could expand its population into. That was during the exponential growth phase. Over time, though, what we're hoping is that resources will either be used up or made not available via social distancing, and that it's going to slow the death rate of, in this particular case that I'm using, the virus, and will use up, over time the resources will be used up, and slowly the death rate is going to increase and the birth rate will decrease. And this will slow the growth of the population, which you can see on the curve as a reduction in the sharpness. So this is while it's still infecting people before we start social distancing, and then you start to see a slowing on the curve because we were limiting resources available to the virus to grow and expand into new hosts. And so this is slowing of the growth, and this is where we want to hit, and eventually we're hoping that we can cause a crash in the population. And so here is when eventually the birth and the death rate will reach a relatively constant rate, and the population will cease to increase, which will be this flat line at the top of the curve. Oh, come on. Change slides. They don't like me. Okay, so let's talk about different types of population. Well, let's talk about the equations that are involved in calculating these exponential and logistic growth curves. I know some of y'all are real scared by math and equations, but as somebody who struggles a lot with math, I find these very, very intuitive, and in this particular very unique and unprecedented time, I think understanding population growth models is very important, and it will probably be intuitive to all of you. So this is the equation for exponential growth. This is the equation for logistic growth. For exponential growth, since there's no limitation on the size of the population, the number of individuals in the next generation can be calculated as the rate of reproduction, which is this piece of the equation here, r sub I, that's the reproductive rate, times the size of the population. Whenever we're talking about equations in ecology, n always equals the population size. And you can see that this reproductive rate is a pretty easy calculation. It's number of individuals being born, or perhaps number of new cases. This is death. In our case, if we're talking about like modeling a virus population growth model, this would be number of people recovered from the virus. And then immigration and emigration would be new cases into the population. Like, say, for instance, we were doing genetic studies of only incoming transmissions of the coronavirus. This would be new ones that have come into the country via ports, and then emigration would be individuals who left the country and spread it out. This is the kind of data you would collect from if you wanted to study the population dynamics of a virus. That's the kind of data you would collect to get the reproductive rate. And then N would be probably the number, and the population size would be the number of people infected if we're studying viruses specifically. So that's this part of the equation. Stated another way, the change in population size, which is delta n here, over the change in time, which is delta t here, will be the product of these two numbers. So not too difficult of an equation. Then we also have a logistic growth curve, I already covered that. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of my own notes. So for logistic growth, for a population in an area with a limitation of one or more resources, we also have to consider the carrying capacity of the area in the population curve. And as the population begins to get close to the carrying capacity, the growth of the population is going to slow. And in the calculation for the logistic curve, this is considered with an extra factor, K. And K always represents carrying capacity in when we're talking about growth models in ecology. So this part of the equation here is the carrying capacity minus the actual population size divided by the carrying capacity of that population. If you're trying to do a logistic growth curve model for a virus, you might calculate carrying capacity based on past viral cases. So let's say we were a virologist trying to study population dynamics of coronavirus. We might use information from past pandemics to estimate what the carrying capacity of coronavirus may be. So like the Spanish flu that came in 1912, we might try to somehow, even though our population, the human population size, which is the resource available for the virus, was much smaller, then you might be able to extrapolate that to calculate what the possible carrying capacity of coronavirus might be. So that's K, carrying capacity. So logistic growth curve model really only differs from exponential growth in that there's going to be some parameter included in the equation that accounts for how big the population can actually get given the resources. And for things like bacteria or viruses that affect humans, this carrying capacity is going to be based on the number of human individuals in the world, basically. So again, this is another example of how population is going to be defined differently depending on what your question is. Sorry, that was probably more than you wanted to know, but I actually really like studying growth models, especially since they're super relevant to what's going on right now today. So, I have already given you a very great real-world example of looking at population dynamics, but let's look at some other examples that are less depressing. The length of time that it takes for a population to reach the carrying capacity is going to be determined by the generation time and the lifespan of the individual. So like I said before, for seals, it takes them almost 30 years to reach carrying capacity, as opposed to the Daphnia, which can reach carrying capacity in not even a month. And that has to do a lot with their generation time. Daphnia, seals take a couple of years to reach sexual maturity and will live a really long time, whereas Daphnia reproduce every couple days. And although they can live relatively long, they're going to show a much quicker generation time because it doesn't take them that long to reach sexual maturity. Bacteria and viruses, for instance, have extremely short generation times because they reproduce extremely quickly. But they also, depending on how long a viral load can survive in a host, that might also limit their growth capacity as well. So a really good virus or bacteria infection is going to be able to live in its host without killing it or without causing any interference in its health, because the longer that individual is infected and is healthy, the more they're going to interact with other people in the population and spread that bacteria or virus around, which is why coronavirus has spread so quickly, is that a lot of the people that are infected with it may not even know they have it, or maybe they have really, really mild symptoms, and so they're going around and still interacting with other hosts and spreading that virus. Well, I did not expect to be talking about coronavirus this whole lecture, but it's just so relevant. I can't not, Okay. So in the real world, again, these models, they don't work exactly because they're based on estimates of generation time. There are a lot of factors that you include in a model that just aren't going to perfectly reflect what's happening in nature. And just like the feedback loops that you might have learned about last semester in Gen Bio, there's going to be some adjustment in the population size as the population nears the carrying capacity. Quite often in real life scenarios, the population, especially if their generation time is short, they're going to overshoot their carrying capacity, and there's going to be negative growth for a few generations until the population achieves a carrying capacity. So until the population size is equal to the carrying capacity, that's when the population size is going to level out. And in fact, you're actually noticed in the Daphnia curve that even when it reaches carrying capacity, there's not exactly a flat line, but some constant adjustments to the population size. And what we're hoping is that with coronaviruses, we're hoping to lower that carrying capacity by all of us staying home and not touching each other, so that we can get to this carrying capacity line sooner and then cause the population to start to drop and flatten out because we're not increasing the resources available to the virus. Carrying capacity may change over time too, and one instance in where it does change is when two or more populations are present that are interacting in an area, and the carrying capacity of the area will change over time as a result of this relationship. In the graph that you see here, the changes are in the snowshoe hare and the lynx. This is a classic example of population cycling because this lynx is so closely tied to the snowshoe hare that it's feeding on. And this shows how the relationship between the two can act to change the carrying capacity of each population. So let's think about the hare first. In some years, there is abundant rain, and this means that there's a lot for the hares to eat, and they reproduce like rabbits, because they are, and with the large number of offspring and the food to support them, the population will increase. As a result of the increase in the number of hares, this means there will be more food for the lynx, and that means the carrying capacity for the lynx will increase. And so the population of lynx increases. This means more of the hares will be eaten, which means fewer will be able to reproduce. This in turn will reproduce the carrying capacity for the hares. And as the number of the hares decreases, the carrying capacity of the lynx will then decrease, and the population size will decrease as a result. And so the hares will begin to recover, and so on and so on, and that's why you see all these individual population cycles in the population. The relationship between the two populations is going to result in a constant change in the population over time. In some years, both are favored. Both the carrying capacities are going to increase, whereas others, there might be a drought, which reduces the carrying capacity of both of the groups. So the carrying capacity is integrally tied to the resources that are available in the environment as well as species interaction. So the snowshoe hare is influencing the lynx populations because they feed on them, and then in turn, the lynx might be limiting the carrying capacity of the snowshoe hare by feeding on them. So let's talk about human population growth. We can use demographics to look at how the human population has changed over time and how it's currently changing in different parts of the world. Oh my God, okay, look at this graph. Okay, so too soon, GenBio. So throughout much of history, human populations have remained fairly constant in living in the logistic growth pattern nearing the carrying capacity for the population. About 300 years ago, the population began to substantially increase and re-entered the exponential phase of growth, which has continued through the current line that you see here. What caused this exponential growth? One of the factors has been the Industrial Revolution. During this time, changes in the way we grow, process, and distribute food made the abundant resources available, and that increased the number of reproductively viable individuals and increased the carrying capacity of the environment for the human population because there were now more resources. Additionally, the technology allowed for better protection of individuals. There was development of better building materials, safer houses, and this allowed for more protection against predators, the weather, etc. Additionally, there were improvements in our understanding of diseases, and treatments were developed for some common ailments that were once seen deadly. Smallpox is one really great example, at least in the United States. Oh, cool. This is an example of the flu. So consider the flu. Throughout history, the flu would have been seen as a death sentence. There were no medicines to treat the symptoms, and there was little understanding of the cause. And this is because any of the individuals in the population would die for lack of treatments. These would be immunocompromised people. But today, we have a better understanding of the flu, and we're able to treat individuals to give them a better chance of living through the flu and treating them through vaccination. And so vaccinations are also really responsible for this exponential growth in the human populations, because particularly in the United States and other countries that are wealthy and privileged enough to be able to have access to vaccines, we've seen really dramatic increases in population growth because of that. There are a couple features here that can show that the changes can occur. So the first is a significant drop in the population around the 14th century, which was a result of the bubonic plague. This spread through Europe and killed a large percentage of the population. And one I just brought up. I wrote these notes a little while ago, and I am now realizing how relevant they are now. A little less significant but substantial was the Spanish flu outbreak in 1918. So you can notice on the curve there's sort of like a small stop in progress right around here-ish. Is kind of like a small stop. And the real significance of the Spanish flu may not have been the number of individuals that died, although about 5% of the world's population died. The fact is that it targeted healthy middle-aged individuals. What that means is that there's a loss in the reproductive age of the group. And that had some really long-lasting effects on the population. Because if you get rid of all the individuals of those middle ages that are the ones that are mainly reproducing, you don't have those older people adding new individuals to the population, and it's going to take a long time for the younger individuals to reach sexual maturity so they can also increase the population. It'll be really interesting to see the effects that the coronavirus is going to have on this population growth curve. We still don't know enough about that disease to really be able to predict what it's going to have on the structure of the population and our ability to increase in size. Oh, God. There's another note from Brother Albert in here. As the population continues to increase, there's an ever-increasing chance that an outbreak of another pandemic could result in significant alteration of the growth of the human population. Oh, boy. Okay, so let's move on to age structures. So we're still talking about demography and the human population growth. The current human populations in different parts of the world can be used to predict the changes in the population that will occur over time. So if you look at the graph at the top, you can see how different areas of the world are predicted to change in the populations differently over the next 50 years. I think most striking are the changes in Europe, where the population can be predicted to decrease, and in Africa, where the population is predicted to dramatically increase. So how can we determine this information? How do we get prediction graphs like this? What is the information that goes into models to look at population growth? What you can use are these things called population pyramids that sort out the age structure of a population. These give the distribution of the population into different age ranges that may be suited to indicate how the population will change over time. The population can be divided into 3 distinct groups, which will determine how the population will change over time. So like I talked about before with the Spanish flu, we talked about pre-reproductive range. These are the portion of the individuals will not contribute to the next generation. There's also the reproductive range. These are individuals which are currently adding to the next generation, so they are sexually mature and producing offspring. And then there's the post-reproductive range. These are individuals that are not going to contribute to the next generation because they have passed their point of sexual reproduction. For some areas like Kenya, the highest proportion of the population is in the pre-reproductive age, which means that as the population continues to grow and conditions improve, there's more food, there's better health care. This creates the possibility the numbers in the reproductive range 20 years from now will increase, and therefore the total number of the population will continue to grow. In an area like Sweden, where there's been a reduction in birth rate as well as a reduction in death at an early age, the pyramid does not have a large proportion of individuals in the pre-reproductive area, which means that as the population ages, unless there's an increase in the birth rate, the population will remain steady or even begin to decrease as the highest proportion of the population reaches the post-reproductive age. And we can use information like these age structure graphs to then make predictions like the ones that are in this graph above. But these data can be formed from other natural populations as well, not just humans. So it'll be really interesting at the end of this pandemic to see if it has changed the age structure of individual countries at all, or the human population in total, and then use that to predict how it might influence population growth in the future. One important factor in studying population ecology is also to look at survivorship. Unlike humans, the population growth or decline of many animals may be determined by the proportion of individuals which will survive at any given age, and this term is referred to as survivorship. So survivorship is the proportion of individuals which will survive at any given age. That is what survivorship is. So you can think of it this way: the shape of the survivorship curve will determine the probability that an individual will die at a given age, and that this curve is the inverse of the mortality at a given age. That is, the high survivors at any given age, there's a low probability that that individual will die. So if you have high survivorship, then you have low mortality. Each type of these survivorship curves is going to represent a different strategy to ensure enough individuals will survive to make the next generation grow. The first one is type 1. This is a human population. This is a human survivorship curve. These are individuals which will have very low mortality at a young age and a very sharp increase as that individual ages. You can see in these individuals, they'll only have a few young at a time, but they invest a lot of energy in the care of the young to make sure that a high proportion of the population reaches the reproductive age. So you see type 1 survivorship curves in a lot of species that invest in parental care and taking care of their young, because it increases their survivorship. And the key here is the energy and time spent on the care of the embryos and the infant as it's developing, that allows it so that it can then grow up and produce its own offspring. In type 2 curves, in this example, this is Hydra. They're, maybe you saw these in Gen Bio 1. These are like little sedentary jellyfish that are really small. In this type 2 curve, there's an equal chance of death through the life age of the population. This means there's an equal probability of death throughout the life, and these individuals will produce moderate numbers of offspring, and they're going to invest some energy in the young, but often they release them. So a lot of aquatic animals like Hydra, they just kind of release their gametes off. Maybe they might brood the eggs for a little bit, but then they'll release them, and so there's not a lot of investment in parental care, which makes you see this kind of straight line. Yeah, and so for Hydra, these are, like I said, these are these really small cnidarians. In some of the offspring, they'll form some of their offspring by cloning via buds, so they'll have like multiple little buds off of their little sedentary colony, but they are small and they're really likely to be eaten by other species throughout the life of the individual. And then in type 3, these are individuals which will produce a large number of offspring during reproduction, but will allow the offspring to go on their free in its own resources to survive. So this is stuff that just like make a ton of eggs and then they just release them into the environment to fend for themselves. And the strategy here is that if they release a large number of offspring, it's the hope that at least a few will survive until reproductive age, and then once they reach a certain age, they'll be assured to live for a long time. One example for this curve is the oyster. When you think about oyster, when the reproduction occurs, the embryos are free to swim in the ocean, but they are very constantly eaten by a number of fish and other species. I actually have a bottle of oyster eggs in my refrigerator for feeding to my marine tank, because oysters make a lot of eggs, and so it's really easy for people to farm them and sell them for aquarium enthusiasts like myself. This means that it's highly likely the individual is going to die at an early age, but once the oyster finds a spot and settles in, it forms that really hard shell around it. There's not a lot of other species that are going to be able to eat that oyster because it's protected, and it means they're really likely to live for a long time. So they have little in this one. So for these type survivorship curves, you might be expected to explain the parental investment at each curve. So with type 1, high parental investment. Type 2, moderate parental investment. Type 3, almost no parental investment at all, resulting in really high mortality of the young. But once they establish themselves, then they can live for a really long time. So let's say you go to the store, you see this pretty little plant right here in the store, and you're looking to buy a plant that's going to have the highest likelihood of the longest lifespan. Do you want to buy this plant based on its survivorship curve when it's young or when it's old? I'll let you think for a second. That's right. You want to buy it when it's young because it's more likely to survive when it's young. If the curve was the opposite and you had the proportion surviving being higher out here, then you would want to wait until this plant is a little older and there's going to be a lower likelihood of dying, at least until it gets near the full lifespan. So, reproduction is essential for the survival of a species, but it is very energetically costly. Let's talk a little bit about why animals don't produce as many offspring as possible every time they get pregnant. Basically, we're asking the question, if the type 3 approach is to make a large number of offspring and hope that a few survive, why don't all species do this? Why don't they all just make as much as they possibly can and just release it into the water? One of those reasons is because it is very energetically costly to reproduce. For oysters, there's only the investment in making the small eggs and the sperm, which will be released and on their own. Other animals, the development will occur inside the animals. This will require the additional nutrients to support the offspring until birth. If too many are present, then the demands are too much for the mother to meet, and they may exhaust their own reserves at the detriment of their own health. This is basically what is shown in the upper graph on here, with the number of offspring each year plotted against the mortality rate of the adults of the species. So every time they reproduce, they increase their mortality rate. Yeah. Okay. This clearly shows that for these individuals which are attempting to meet the needs of the offspring, there will be increased demand on the parents, which will increase the number of adult deaths, which may counteract the increased number of individuals that they produce. So if you think about like a mother pig and she has too many piglets, then there will be a reproduction in the energy reserves of the mother at birth. In addition, this means there will be more milk produced to feed the young, all which are going to require extra food. In a barn, the farmer is able to compensate by changing the type or the amount of feed, but in the wild, the mother may have to increase the risk of her own life to get that extra feed, and therefore might increase her risk of death. This is also similar with birds. Increased number of individual baby birds in the nest means more trips away to find the food. The increased number of offspring may also decrease the size of the offspring, so there's only so much room inside the uterus of an animal, and if the number of offspring is too large, they'll have to be born at an earlier date in the pregnancy, and therefore they'll be smaller and weaker at birth. This too may limit the amount of food available for the offspring, which means the babies are not going to grow as fast. In this lower graph, which shows the average size of a nestling, which is a newly hatched bird in the nest, against the size of the clutch, and a clutch is the number of eggs that are laid at one time in the nest. if you think about this, the limit here is not the size inside the egg, but rather the amount of food available for the offspring. The increased number means there's less to go around to each of them. So you can see the extra demands on the parents, or the reduced nutrition for the animals and plants, which provide nutrients to their young, and that's going to limit the growth of the individuals. So just making a ton of offspring all at once and then letting them fend for themselves is not always the best mechanism of reproduction to maximize the number of offspring in each group. It may be better to invest in the survival of a fewer individuals to make sure they actually reach reproductive maturity and contribute to the next generation. So I know that was a long one. Thanks for sticking in. Next week we'll start talking about community ecology. Okay, bye.